Some women believe they're healing when they're actually emotionally revisiting the same wound. And that's a hard truth to hear because when you've been hurt, when you've been disappointed, when you've been betrayed, it feels normal to keep thinking about it. It feels normal to revisit the conversation, to revisit the moment, to revisit the feeling. And sometimes we call that processing. Sometimes we call that being careful. Sometimes we call that protecting ourselves. But what if we're not healing? What if we're reopening? What if we're returning to the same emotional injury over and over again without realizing we're doing it? Because there's a difference between remembering something and living inside of it. There's a difference between learning from pain and repeatedly reliving pain. And a lot of women don't notice when that line gets crossed because it doesn't feel like you're holding on. It feels like you're being aware. It feels like you're being cautious. It feels like you're making sure it doesn't happen again. But sometimes, without realizing it, the wound becomes the lens. The thing that happened years ago starts influencing how you interpret what is happening today. And when that happens, the relationship is no longer dealing with one moment, it's dealing with two: the current moment and the old wound sitting behind it. And that's where a lot of marriages get stuck. Not because the current issue is so big, but because the current issue is being filtered through an old injury. And this pattern shows up in more marriages than people realize. Take cheating, for example. A husband may have betrayed trust years ago. The marriage survived. Conversations happened. Apologies happened. The couple stayed together. Life continued. But years later, he gets home late from work and immediately the mind comes back. Not necessarily because of what happened today, but because of what happened then. The old wound speaks first. The old injury becomes the reference point. And before the current situation is even fully understood, the past has already entered the room. Or maybe it's disrespect. Maybe there was a season where one spouse felt unheard, dismissed, talked over, not valued. And now, years later, a simple disagreement happens, a normal difference of opinion. But it doesn't feel normal because the mind isn't just responding to today's disagreement. It's responding to every unresolved feeling attached to the old one. The current conversation becomes connected to the old injury, and the reaction becomes bigger than the moment. Then there are in-law conflicts. A lot of marriages carry wounds from family dynamics. Things that happened years ago. Things that were said. Things that were allowed. Things that were never fully repaired. And now every family gathering, every holiday, every commitment gets filtered through that history. Not because anyone is intentionally trying to hold on to it, but because pain creates association. The mind remembers. And when something resembles the old injury, even slightly, the emotional response can return immediately. The same thing happens in blended families. A lot of blended families carry complicated histories, different parenting styles, different loyalties, different expectations, old hurts, old disappointments, old frustrations. And sometimes what's happening today isn't actually the problem. The problem is that today's moment is touching yesterday's wound, and the mind connects them automatically because that's what the mind does. It looks for patterns, it looks for danger, it looks for similarities. It tries to protect us from being hurt again. But here's where it gets complicated. Sometimes the mind becomes so focused on preventing old pain that it starts seeing old pain everywhere. And that's when healing gets interrupted, because now, instead of experiencing the relationship as it exists today, you're experiencing it through what happened years ago. Now let's talk about why this happens, because this isn't about weakness. It's not about being dramatic. It's not about being unable to move on. It's actually something much deeper. Sometimes women keep replaying the pain because staying guarded feels safer than becoming vulnerable again. The wound becomes familiar, the hurt becomes familiar, the caution becomes familiar. And strangely enough, familiar can feel safer than hope. Because if you stay guarded, you don't have to risk being disappointed again. If you stay guarded, you don't have to risk trusting fully again. If you stay guarded, you don't have to risk getting hurt the same way twice. So the mind convinces itself, I'm protecting myself. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes what started as protection becomes a prison, because now the walls that was built to keep pain out also keeps connection out. The guard that was meant to protect your heart starts preventing your heart from fully engaging. And that's where many women find themselves years later, still married, still committed, still showing up, but emotionally connected to a wound that happened long ago. And that wound quietly influences how they see everything now. And this is where the consequences start showing up. Not always in obvious ways, not always in ways people immediately recognize, but they show up because when old pain remains the emotional reference point, it changes how you experience the relationship. It changes how you interpret situations. It changes how you respond. And sometimes it changes without you even realizing it. One of the first places it shows up is emotional distance. Not because you don't love each other, not because you're trying to create distance, but because it's hard to stay emotionally close to someone when part of you is still protecting yourself from them. And protection creates space. Protection creates caution. Protection creates hesitation. So now, instead of fully leaning into the relationship, you're keeping part of yourself back. Not all of yourself, just enough to stay safe, just enough to avoid feeling vulnerable, just enough to avoid getting hurt again. And over time, that changes the connection. Then comes walking on eggshells, not always because someone is angry, not always because someone is difficult, but because both people become sensitive to the old wound. Now conversations feel loaded. Simple situations feel bigger than they really are. Everybody is trying not to trigger something. Everybody is trying not to revisit something. Everybody is trying not to reopen something. And that creates tension because relationships aren't meant to be lived on eggshells. They're meant to be lived with trust. They're meant to be lived with openness. They're meant to be lived with the freedom to communicate. But when old pain is still directing the emotional traffic, freedom starts disappearing. Then comes assuming bad intentions. And this is a huge one because once you've been hurt, it's easy to start viewing current behavior through the lens of past behavior. The mind says, I already know what this means. And that's exhausting because no matter how much progress is made, the relationship keeps getting pulled backwards. No matter how much growth happens, the old injury keeps demanding attention. No matter how many years have passed, the emotional wound keeps acting like it happened yesterday. And that becomes heavy for both people. Now, here's the part that's often missed because when people talk about healing, they usually jump straight into forgiveness. Just forgive, just let go, just move on. But healing is rarely that simple because if it were, everybody would already be healed. The real beginning of healing starts with awareness, and awareness starts with questions. Questions most people never stop to ask. Questions that create clarity. Questions that reveal what's actually happening. Questions like, am I responding to what is happening right now? Or am I responding to what happened years ago? That's a powerful question because sometimes the answer surprises you. And those questions slow the emotional reaction down. They create space. And in that space, healing becomes possible because healing isn't pretending the wound never happened. Healing is refusing to let the wound control every current moment. Healing is learning how to separate yesterday from today. Healing is learning how to see the present clearly. Healing is learning how to stop giving old pain authority over current reality. And that changes everything because many marriages don't need another argument. They don't need another fight. They don't need another conversation where both people defend their position. What they need is two people willing to stop dragging yesterday into every conversation today. Two people willing to recognize when old pain has become the emotional reference point. Two people willing to ask harder questions. Two people willing to become aware because awareness changes things. Awareness creates choice. Choice creates healing, and healing creates space, real space. Not because the past disappeared, not because the wound never happened, but because the wound is no longer making every decision. The wound is no longer deciding how every current moment should be experienced, because peace becomes possible when yesterday stops sitting at the table during every conversation. Peace becomes possible when people finally start responding to what is happening now instead of what happened years ago. And that right there is where healing begins. And that is how long marriages are built.